Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the participants again to the third session of our webinar series of Archaeological Sciences Center, IIT Gandhinagar. For the new participants, I hope many of the participants have joined for the third time, but for the sake of new participants, this webinar series has been started by IIT Gandhinagar in the month of October, and we are planning to have one talk at the end of every month uh, by eminent scholars, eminent archaeologists who have worked in the field on various aspects of archaeology and have contributed a lot, so that we can learn, we can listen to their field experiences and also their field knowledge, so that all of us can be benefited, starting from a student to scholars as well as the general public. So we have thrown it open to all sections of the public so that it can benefit a wider audience. So today we have two eminent archaeologists with us. We are really honored to welcome Professor Shanti Pappu and Dr. Akhilesh Kumar, who have pioneered the prehistoric archaeology in India, who have worked extensively in the southern state of Tamil Nadu, around the site of Athrampokam, and a host of contemporary sites spread across a wider area, and have unraveled many interesting aspects of prehistoric archaeology, how human presence had been here for the past maybe 1.6 million years, and how gradually they have transformed their lithic technology, and also how they were occupied the entire area in a systematic manner. So without wasting much time, because we all know the great work these two archaeologists have done, I would request Professor Shanti Pappu and Dr. Akhilesh Kumar to present their talk to us. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'll just share the screen. So thank you very much for inviting us to be here, and we are really delighted, Akhilesh and I, to be here on this very eminent forum to present our thoughts. And just before I speak, I just like to wish everyone for Christmas and a very safe and healthy New Year with lots of good luck. So this is the topic for today. And what we are going to do before I begin my talk, I just want to thank all our colleagues, the large and growing team of scientists with which our team is working with, students, volunteers, and the local community who are involved in so many different aspects of our projects, without whom none of this work is possible. So what are we going to speak about today? We all understand this question. We all want to know, who am I? And we have been exploring it in India, as you know, from so many different perspectives. And today, we are going to take a brief look at the other species as well. Who were they? And explore their behavior in a very tiny region in Southeast India. We have been asked in this talk to keep in mind that there are going to be people from different backgrounds, not only archaeologists. And so I'll try to keep this at a level for everyone. And I'll begin by introducing some of the issues we are going to speak about. So for prehistorians in this meeting, please bear with us for a while. So what are we going to discuss? In this talk, we will look at our own research in the context of some of the bigger debates in Indian prehistory and try to fill in some of these pieces in the puzzle you can see here, or rather change the boundaries of the puzzle itself. And what we are not going to do is a review of Indian prehistory or of human evolution. And for this, you'll have a lot of sources online. Today's talk is going to be all about the teeny little details that help redefine our global perspectives. It's not going to have a lot of technological jargon, details of lithics or sites, but to present an overview of our projects right from research to public outreach. And we'll be happy, of course, to take questions at the end. So this talk is all about people. I'll just go back here. It's about people today, the networks of collaboration between so many different specialists and the local community. It's also about people in the future generations for whom we need to leave behind these sites and these tools, and not merely publications in journals or artifacts in museums. And above all, it's all about the nameless people in the past who whose lives have left behind these fragmentary clues and remains of material culture that we study, embedded within the relics of ancient environments. So this is going to be all about the talk. And just as a little introduction for non-archaeologists who may be here, we are going to travel back in time to the Pleistocene, this period which dates back to around 2.6 million years, and which is characterized by often dramatic climate changes in some parts of the world. And in India, a number of studies have highlighted the importance and the antiquity of monsoonal patterns and grasslands, which we'll come a little later to, and in the context of influencing occupation of hominins and other fauna. And it is within the context of these Pleistocene climatic changes that we are going to situate the story of human evolution. And in India, this story is primarily reflected in stone artifacts that lie beneath our feet all over the country. And we also have in the more recent phases evidence of more aesthetic and symbolic aspects, as in some engraved ostrich eggshells or perhaps rock art or whatever. We are not going to talk about this tiny bit on top, the Holocene, which witnessed some dramatic climate shifts in which we are right now, or the Anthropocene. So this is the background to the talk. And we are also going to talk a lot about stone tools. You're going to hear terms like cores, flakes, and of course the tools themselves, or hammer stones from which these flakes were detached. And beginning from the selection of raw material to shape into different tools, to the final stage of discard. This is what we are going to discuss today. And we are going to talk about different types of raw material, issues of fracture mechanics, force, angle, expertise, and cognitive controls of the tool maker. In addition to that, various aspects come in here. We are also going to talk about socialization, learning, desire, and the concepts which are in the mind of the tool maker. So to do that, we often have to move between scales, right from the world to the region, to the site, to the trench, artifact, and deeper within. And we'll constantly move and shift between these scales to discuss our work. The process of moving from artifacts or from environmental proxies to behavior is not straightforward. So to do that, it's a very important aspect of the study is our approaches, both theoretical and methodological, that must control our impulse to jump from tools or other proxies to reconstruct past behavior, whether these are from excavations, as you see here, or sections, or even cores, to propose models on past behavior. So as we all know, it's not just about the artifact, it's about the context, relationships between artifacts and the sediments. It's also all about sample size on which we base our final conclusions. It's about the environment, formation processes, and it's also about us, about our paradigms that we accept and which determine our worldview. So a little background to whom we are speaking about. Who made these tools? So I'm not going to give you the story of human evolution, but we'll just look at some of these approaches. And when I was in school or even in college, these, can you see this here, this linear sequences are what we were taught. And it actually exists even today, not only in some textbooks, but also in popular culture. And you even have a 2001 Space Odyssey monolith thrown in. So, but Darwin, of course, was different. And if you look at him, his thoughts were way in advance of anyone else. And from there, we have progressed to tree models of human evolution with now greater complexity. So as species are added in, you have more branches popping up. And then you have other models. And as you can see in this one, you have a lot more question marks, a lot more uncertainty, which is growing with this. And you have even concepts of other approaches of depicting human evolution. For example, whether it should be shown as a braided stream, in particular in the light of recent discoveries of admixture and introgression. So if you take a look at one of these, this is one of the models proposed, you can get all the references from where we have taken images. Here it's there in the PowerPoint itself. So this recent model highlights the complexity, and what is really important, it's got all these red lines here. And these red lines depict possible or determined gene flow between previously discrete species. And this leads to a whole new paradigm into thinking about who we are and where we came from. And what the authors show here are species in different colors and the little dotted with possibilities of having more than one lineage and dotted lines indicating these connections. And to complicate this story even more, recent developments which propose new models of multi-regional evolution of modern humans, for example, within Africa, completely change the way in which we think about human evolution and have turned various traditional models that we study in universities, etc., completely upside down. Now, who was there in India? We have an incomplete story as of now. All of us are familiar with the Narmada cranium at Hathnora and other postcranial remains. But the problem is that these have been variously interpreted by different scholars, ranging from Homo erectus to archaic Homo sapiens. Other evolutionary models, it shows a mosaic of features of African and Asian traits. It has been dated variously and the context is rather unclear. So at present, the story is incomplete. But the second part of this story is who made the tools in India. As regards very early tools termed the Oldu one, it is as yet unclear whether or not this very early culture existed at all in India, and this point will come to a little later. We presume that with the Acheulean, we have the existence of Homo erectus sensulator, although we don't have any fossils at the same, so we can think about this. When we come to the Middle Paleolithic, we literally hold our head in our hands. There are so many possibilities. Modern humans, of course, maybe Neanderthals in some regions, Denisovans, some other archaic species. Some have suggested that the Middle Paleolithic were indeed here with modern humans by at least 125,000 years. Others disagree and believe that modern humans appeared with the late Paleolithic far later in time. So we keep this in mind, and we'll come to this slightly later in this talk. So although fossils are few, and it's not that they have not been searched for, there have been in the past many systematic attempts to search for fossils both in India and in Pakistan, and they have largely failed. And it may be just a matter of luck finally. Whatever it is, while we are desperately searching for fossils, we often forget that there are very, very rich treasures under our feet, and we should not ignore these. So at least for South Asian prehistory, we stand on the shoulders of giants. And there has been a huge volume of research right from the 19th century onwards. This is for sure. So let's take a little stock of this. Since the 1930s and especially from the 1960s onwards, there have been many systematic regional studies all across India. This map just shows you some of the major excavated Lower Paleolithic sites, the little red dots, and the shaded areas are some of the very intensively surveyed regions. And if you see this little inset over here with lots of red dots, that's the region where we are working, and really the density is very high. So we cannot say that no work has been done. A lot of work has been done, but some of the not so good news part is that we have very few large-scale excavated sites. And although observations made from surface scatters or test pits are very valuable, they have limited implications for behavior, investigating behavior. So this is one of the issues. The good news is that we have an excellent record of a diversity of sites in different geomorphological contexts, whether it's in rock shelters, regoliths, fluvial deposits, colluvial, etc., lacustrine, playa. And for most sites, people have reconstructed detailed stratigraphic records and region-specific climatic studies, local climate changes. There are also synthesis of this data, like you see over here from some important publications. We are aware of the importance of the antiquity of the monsoons and grasslands, which have clearly influenced patterns of human occupation and hominin ecological niches. It is also clear that unlike many other parts of the world, India always had a very wonderful set of resources, you can put it that way, for hominids to exploit, mosaic habitats and rich resources over the Pleistocene that have even led some to speculate on very high hominid population densities. So it would have been a very pleasant place to be in over most of this area if you were a Pleistocene hominin. The not so good news is the relationship between paleo-environments and people, and interpretations of what this means. Where is dinner, for example? There is sparse fauna in association with Paleolithic sites, even rarer evidence of cut marks on bones. And despite recent very exciting papers on faunal turnovers and the disappearance of megafauna, whether it is due to environmental factors or human impacts or whatever it is, we have very little evidence from the sites themselves, and they remain exciting hypotheses. There is also a need to build communication links and bridges between archaeologists and people studying paleoenvironment or other quaternary scientists. Archaeologists, for example, perhaps often do not go into the intricacies of the details of other scientists. And on the other side, paleoenvironmental studies drawing either on cores or excavated samples or sections or whatever, they often lack an understanding of the nature of the archaeological record and models of Paleolithic behavior, while proposing some ideas on the impact of environmental changes on populations. So these are some issues which we need to work out just by better communication. Where do we stand in time? Again, this map shows you dated Lower Paleolithic sites, and I agree it's very few. Most of them have been done about 2 decades ago with very few recent dates. The most reliable dates would be from the excavated sites, but at the same time, we should not discard dates that come from section cuttings or from areas in proximity to sites, although they must be looked at with caution, but they should not be discarded. Any bit of evidence is good. And the paucity of this, one of the major reasons is very simple, it's a lack of funding. And we need more labs which are dedicated solely to archaeological chronology. So the impact of this paucity of dates is that it severely impacts global comparisons and hampers our ability to even trace evolutionary stages through time. For example, evolution within the Acheulean, we rely a lot on typo-technological studies that render sometimes a question mark on the interpretations. So this is a bad news. The good news in terms of looking at lithics is that we have moved away from simple descriptions of tools and shopping lists of tool types to an understanding or an attempt to understand reduction sequences and to go deeper into the tools, from experimental studies to functionality to even now residue, and try to go look deeper into aspects of cognition. So for example, what is the meaning of the variability we see in the shapes of hand axes in assemblage, or any other question? So I would put that on the positive side. Whatever it is, we know for sure in India, we have a very long and continuous culture sequence. So this is what we are all used to seeing, the Acheulean, Middle, Upper, Mesolithic, whatever, through time. But when we come to the issue of constructing culture sequences, so this is something we are all familiar with something that is pre-Acheulean appearing and disappearing conceptually through time. But we should look back also and see that alternate models have been proposed. For example, this one till the 1960s was based on African terminologies. And then we switched on to this scheme of European terminologies. There are other models where, for example, the Upper and Mesolithic are lumped together into a late Paleolithic for some very, very valid reasons. You have the pre-Acheulean appearing and disappearing. For example, the whole conceptual change regarding the Suanian and other peninsular Indian core and flake assemblages. You have sometimes chronology, cultural terminologies based on geological chronologies. And you have even proposals of something else, maybe something far simpler. So whatever it is, there is a need that as our dates and chronology is refined, we have to stop periodically and re-examine the terms that we are using. So at the same time, to add to this complexity, it is a reality that culture sequences in India overlap in space and time, and there is no reason in South Asia over this vast geographic area to accept similar trajectories. For example, we can see contemporaneity between perhaps a late Acheulean and an early Middle, or in some regions, completely different cultural trajectories. And it's not at all surprising and has to be factored in. The second, which I would call the tyranny of terminologies, is our approaches towards the classification of tools or culture sequences. And so we love stuffing them into boxes, or if you look at in the Indian context, stuffing them into pots. And we should always step back and look at this in the context of their historical development of certain terms we use. So it's far better perhaps to remove these we have been conditioned to look at things in a particular way. And now we should shift our thinking to look at processes, to look at transitions, questions of convergence, intrusion of new technologies. What is the nature of culture change through time and space across the country? I think this is also very important to do. Now we come back to the basic question of migrations into India, perhaps when and by whom. So when we go to the very, very early phase of Mode 1 or Urdu 1, there has been a lot of debate in it, and I'll just take a minute to go through again. Are there any such sites in India that are predating or even contemporary with the early Acheulean? So you have the discoveries at Rivat and Masol have been interpreted variously by different people and debated quite a bit. As we all know, the classical Soan and other non-biface industries in peninsular India have been shifted to the post-Acheulean and perhaps post-Pleistocene also. Nevertheless, even though there is all this debate, I personally feel it is very early to rule out conclusively the non-existence of this phase in India. We don't know. And it just takes one discovery to change our paradigms. So let's leave this question open for now. As regards the Acheulean, there is no doubt that from the Acheulean onwards, there's an unbroken cultural sequence over most of India. And with the evidence not only from Athirampakkam, but many other sites as well, we can presume that this was here, this Acheulean was there in India not very long after it came out of, emerged in Africa, supposedly at a very early dispersal out of Africa. But one should note at the same time that there are many debates within Africa itself as to the sudden appearance of the Acheulean and questions of where it originated. Once you come to the Middle Paleolithic, you get all these wonderful maps with lots of arrows all over the place, which are highlighting a very important fact of the complexity which arises in the dispersal of modern humans. In India, I think that we are still in the process of debating questions of who made these tools and when and how this culture arose. For the upper or late Paleolithic onwards, while modern humans are present, the same arguments are often raised as to whether one is looking at a dispersal of microlithic technologies into India or local evolutionary trajectories or a bit of both. So that's where we are right now. So as you can see here, we've had through time a number of traditional models. For example, distinct time-bound dispersals with an old one or mode one, and then an Acheulean, and then so on and so forth. These are increasingly being challenged. And in particular, when one considers migration of modern humans, the multiple models exist. So you can see here, there are so many divergent views, including this paper which came out a few days ago, suggestive of out of Eurasia, perhaps. So we should really take stock from time to time and realize that the situation is extremely complicated and not be ashamed to admit that there are many things we don't know. So from this, let us move down to India. We are all interested in knowing how India fits into this global picture. You can see here handbags from Athirampakkam and one from Olduvai at the India and the World exhibition. And we are very interested in looking at these big pictures. But at the same time, in order to understand the big picture, we really need to zoom down, pardon the terrible pun, into the details. Where are these sites? How do we decode them? What do the tools mean in terms of behavior? What was the environment like at very, very micro scales of research? And this is where we are going to go right now. So what we are going to do is, what we're going to do is to go into the myriad little pictures before we go back to look at the big one. And for that, we are going to move down to this tiny region in Southeast India where we are working. And in Tamil Nadu, we have three major areas of research interest going on. And I'll speak about Zone 1 and Zone 2 right now. We have projects there which are multidisciplinary and which we have been doing for a very long time. So you can see here Athirampakam, and this is the East Coast, the Eastern Ghats, and this network of various major rivers like the Palar, Kushasthalayaru, Arani, etc. And in zone 2, we are going to look at some of the later sites and questions of dispersal to Sri Lanka. So what are the questions we are looking at? Obviously, we are interested finally in the individual, but we are looking at dispersals, culture change, transition, technological strategies, paleo environments, chronology, and cognitive evolution. And whatever these interlinked zones or approaches we are taking, ultimately we are exploring multiple worlds of these hominins through systematic long-term multidisciplinary studies. And apart from the systematic as well, a little bit of luck as well. So let's look at interpreting landscape scales of spatial patterning in site distribution and what they mean. So when you look at this region which we are currently researching, over here you can see the entire extent. It's about 8,000 square kilometers. And then zooming down to zone 1, for example, core zone 1, around 10 by 10 kilometers. You can see all these little green dots here and yellow dots here, prehistoric sites. And each site has a different story to tell. So with excavations at different sites or test pits or surveys, we attempt to address different questions that we will discuss here. And to do so, obviously, you have multi-pronged survey strategies because the sample size and the nature of the sample which you are collecting is very important, obviously, for any interpretations which we are going to make further. So in addition to random sampling, or transects like you see here, or detailed mapping of surface scatters. We have test pits, ground penetrating radar as well, which helps us, and it's really useful to pick up certain layers or sediments which we are interested in and map how these layers behave across a site or across a broader region, and satellite remote sensing. So in satellite remote sensing, we also factored in an issue of predictive modeling, because as you know, we have very little time and funds. So how do you maximize that? So we worked to develop a set of combinations of variables that were relevant to predict the location of potential new Acheulean, Middle and Late Paleolithic sites, followed by surveys in the projected regions and testing of our hypothesis and either validating or not. So this resulted in wonderful data, which can be, and the model can be refined and used right up to Bengal in similar environmental and geomorphological conditions. So as a result of these studies, we could document again previously known sites, discover new ones, report on the status of sites, ranging from the Acheulean to the Microlithic, and generate a huge database of information on the nature of sites, stratigraphy, the context of tools, etc. And this work is still ongoing. It's a huge work, as you can see, and we are delighted that so many students are now coming forward and joining us to help analyze this material and study this in greater detail. So what does it mean? For example, in this map over here, you have a little circle where it's just a rough area which shows the extent, the concentration of Acheulean sites. And on this site, the same map, but you have the distribution of middle, as you can see, is very vast. So the question is why? Obviously, the answer is not as simple as behavior. That would be too easy. So many other factors need to be considered. One is the differential exposure and preservation of early to middle Pleistocene sediments. Two is the sources of raw material. Acheulean was particularly closely tied to raw material sources and didn't move very far away from that. The third is the actual nature of raw material. For example, sandstones weather very fast, like basalt, so when they are exposed, and we have seen that in some of the new sites we are working at. So this is a question of preservation factors. So some of the very, very old sites may not have as great a sample as we would like. And lastly, of course, behavioral choices and changing modes of life in different populations through time. So when you go deeper into the geomorphology and geology of all these sites, and I've just zoomed in over a small area, we see that they have particular patterns in clustering in particular formations that date obviously to the early to late Pleistocene and eroding out of them. They are absent in certain regions, either because the region they are currently deeply buried, or in areas such as granitic terrains where some of the, for example, for the Acheulean, that were not perhaps very interesting ecologically. So the presence of these sites must be interpreted not only in terms of behavior, but also in terms of all these variables as well. In this little part of our study region, we see that some of the formations, and I'll use some of the names, the Satyavedu formation, for example, is very important in terms of its contribution to raw material sources. And the shales, the laterites or other formations are very important because they contributed source material for the Pleistocene deposits in these regions at these sites. So you see sites in different contexts, buried within and eroding from different facies of ferricretes, ferruginous gravels, fluvial deposits, colluvial deposits of different kinds, as also rock shelters. And through time, the contexts vary. So right at the bottom, you have the Theri sand dunes in southeast Tamil Nadu, closely linked to sea level changes and other processes. And we also came up with some interesting ideas on the very concept of the nature of a site. So we see, for example, find spots, just a few tools in a particular on the surface. We don't really know what these represent. It's quite complex and not very clear. Then you have sites which have a supposed discrete area, for example, Athirampakkam, which is also a factor of visibility of the amount of the deposit which is, or sediments which are exposed today for us to define and classify as a site. And lastly, you have these very low density scatters of artifacts over 2 to 3 kilometers that represent perhaps palimpsests and defy traditional definition of sites. Whatever the pattern we find and how we interpret it, the key factor here is that the intensity of occupation of these landscapes through time is very clear, it cannot be doubted. And it is very evident that through time, there must have been a mosaic resources that sustained this almost continuous occupation throughout the Paleolithic. One of the key aspects is obviously for us raw material, the rocks. So we mapped the distribution, and you can see here these different colors are different types of raw material sources, from quartzites, quartzitic sandstones, chert in some areas, silicified wood also. But it's not the location of the raw material alone which is important, but their form, the morphology. For example, whether they occur as boulders or large cobbles, do they occur as pebbles, do they occur as nodules, slabs, or something else? This is very important because for the Acheulean in particular, if you don't have suitable boulders, cobbles, or very large slabs or nodules of a certain size, it is very difficult to detach large flakes to make tools. So we had to factor in not only the types of raw material, but their morphology. And a third factor is exposures. We could also discuss the availability, how the availability of this raw material changed through time. So there would have been phases when it would have been buried and not accessible at all. Or in other cases, currently buried sources would have been used by Acheulean hominins, for example. So these are some of the ideas which we could think about in our project. Also, variability in the nature of occupation. This shows you that at least for the Acheulean, you see this very clear fragmented reduction sequence across the region, which just means that different areas, people were doing different things consistently. So certain areas where you have evidence of co-reduction, preliminary co-reduction, other areas like Athirampakkam, where you don't have any early stages of manufacture for the Acheulean, but people were coming here for some specific purpose. And these little maps and 3D visualizations just show you the distribution of whether it is cores or tools or waste across the region. So when putting this all together, one can get some bigger picture of landscape scales of mobility. Then we move down through the site to the site. So in the site, as you can see here, all these red dots are sites, and we have been working at Athirampakkam and now at a new site, another one here, and we'll just discuss this a little bit in detail. So when you come to the site, a little bit on our methods. At each site, we devised and adapted strategies to suit the nature of the sediments and obviously the questions asked. Whatever that may be, the recording was always we tried to record to as high a resolution as possible, not only the 3D maps of the tools, but also the boundary, the periphery of each artifact, the angle, the inclination, the pitch at which it's lying in the soil, and so many factors to generate very interesting maps of spatial patterning that can be analyzed statistically, and also 3D visualization of specific levels or even of the entire trench. And this is ongoing, and we hope to publish this, some of these exciting new results soon. When we zoom down further to Athirampakkam, as you know, anyone who has visited the site and picked up tools, please do not pick up tools when you visit sites. It leads to the destruction of sites. So that's just a little note. When walking over the surface, you see these rich clusters of tools eroding from different horizons. And these have been interpreted variously through time. When we excavated, we sampled across the trench, so across the site. So different trenches were taken for different purposes and different questions so that we could get some sort of a representative sample. And it's very interesting to see the variability in ways in which people have thought about this site. So if you go back to the 19th century, Robert Bruce Foote and William King, and this is an illustration by Robert Bruce Foote, and he observed, they felt that the Acheulean came from these gravels. You can see, perhaps, let me just, you can see this gravel bed over here. So they felt that the tools came from this gravel bed. And then later in the 1930s, there was this very famous Yale-Cambridge expedition who wanted to link these terrace sequences and tools across South Asia. And V.D. Krishnaswamy, Patterson, and others who worked here believed that, again, they believed that the Acheulean came from the same horizon. And in fact, Oswald Mencken coined the term Madrasian or the Madras hand-axe tradition, for which it became very famous. So this was what their view was. Then you have the very important excavations by K.D. Banerjee and the ASI, who had a totally different view. So in his view, this particular ferruginous gravel bed did not have an Acheulean. In fact, it had what he called a post-Acheulean. And he was very puzzled to see the Acheulean occurring underneath that on the surface of what was termed a Cretaceous Sri Perumbudur clay. So where you should not get tools. And then he was the first to identify this post-Acheulean continuing right on top as well. So that was really important. And then I came back and did my PhD here. And then after that, Akhilesh and I started our excavations. So what did we find? Again, what we found was completely different. We found when we dug test pits that the Acheulean occurred within what was termed for over 100 years as the Sri Perumbudur, a later Avadi formation, which represented something where you should not expect any Pleistocene hominin occupation. But we found this consistently in each and every trench we excavated and in the test pits. And then on top, we found this horizon, different levels. And like K.D. Banerjee's observations, we felt and we believe this is something, nothing related to the Acheulean, but a Middle Paleolithic in different levels on top. So total, you have got actually 8 sedimentary major levels and a very long culture sequence. And the Acheulean occurs right down to about 9 meters, last tools at around 7 meters depth. And as you can see here, there are levels of silts and clays, and then an intervening pebbly, cobbly sediment, gravel. And you can see that also in the percentage and the size of pebbles through time as you go here. So there are some different sedimentary environments, but very fine-grained. And we did some site formation studies in which we looked at the pattern of clay cracking, the orientation and pitch of tools, and the presence of conjoinable artifacts. And we can clearly say that the Acheulean occupation at the site has been minimally disturbed. There are very, very tiny flakes we can also recover from these deposits. And it is wonderful to reconstruct to some level aspects of prehistoric behavior. So right down you get tools. And finally, when we dated the site through paleomagnetic and cosmogenic nucleate burial dating, we got a range of age estimates. of which we just took a mean estimated age of 1.5, but actually you have quite a range from 1.07 to 1.7 million years at this site. So the implications of this are very interesting. The significance is that although there were dates suggesting this earlier in India, it now could not be doubted anymore that the Acheulean was present in India very early in the early Pleistocene. And this, I believe, is firmly supported by other sites like Isampur. And despite the debates, I firmly believe that sites like Morgaon, Bori, Chirki, Singhi Talav are also as old, as well as others as well, which will come out in future. So this was one thing which was important. Secondly, clearly the Acheulean appears in India not very long after it appeared in Africa. So this leaves us with a lot to think about in terms of either where the Acheulean originated or in terms of the timing and nature of dispersals out of Africa. Although more dated sites will help, the basic premise of the antiquity of occupation in India cannot be doubted anymore. Let's go now to the lithics, and I'll try to keep this very general. So our lithic sample comes from all the trenches excavated across the site. And we see what is really interesting is that we see variability both spatially. So there are some trenches with lots of tools, some with less, and the density per unit area or unit volume changes quite a lot, as also the variability through time. So there are certain phases which are occupied more. So perhaps you can see that certain phases have more denser occupation and certain phases less. And this is really interesting because it has a lot of importance when looking at behavior in space and time at this site. What we also try to do is to go down deeper into Acheulean reduction sequences and try to look at it in some much more detail. And this is an ongoing work. I won't bore you with the statistics, but the assemblage is a typical large flake Acheulean with bifaces, large flake tools, small flake tools, waste products, and very few artifacts on cobble. So this is a very small proportion of the total sample. And equally interesting is that there is no raw material suitable for production of large flakes at Athirampakam in the Acheulean levels. Everything had to be sourced either within radius of 5 to 10 kilometers or perhaps closer, as we have noted in some of the currently deeply buried well sections. So everything, you must consider this factor when we are looking at the reduction sequence. So in this schematic diagram, what it shows you is actually what are the various ways in which they manufacture tools, used them, sometimes perhaps reused, and then discarded. So this is published, so you can have a look at the article for more details. But to make it more interesting and bring people in, so somewhere near the site, away you have these hominins who are going probably in groups, detaching large flakes as a preliminary stage of manufacture. So you have the core and large flakes here. And then they are carrying these large flakes or partly shaped hand axes, cleavers, and other tools to the site. So they are entering the site with all these, and then they are further refining and finishing the tools at the site. How do we know this? We have a lot of waste products, and these waste products are indicative of the final stages of finishing hand axes and cleavers and bifacially flake tools. So there's a lot of them, and they never wasted these because they anticipated raw material shortage. They retouched a lot of these small waste flakes into small flake tools. And then, of course, they used the tools and then discarded them. And another sequence, to simplify, shows that they brought in some tools on cobbles and very few small cores. And what did they carry out? So we presume that one of the things they carried out were hammerstones, because we don't get any at the site. And we assume from our experimental studies that they used hard stone hammers. So we don't find that, and that's something really interesting. And also, when we studied the proportion of hand axes to that of waste flakes, we presume that perhaps some hand axes were carried away from the site, but we're not sure about that. So to understand lithics, we are running and we are continuing to run a series of experiments of large core reduction and also replicating the hand axes. So the aim, which Akhilesh is in charge of this and he's doing all of this, is not to replicate a perfect hand axe. It's easy to make a beautiful hand axe, but that's not the aim. The aim is to try to understand how the hand axes that we see in the archaeological record, or the cleavers, or the large and small flake tools, or anything else were actually made. So that's the aim of what we are doing here in the experiments. And so it's very important to look at lithics from the perspective of trying to get to behavior. Sometimes we get so bogged down in the statistics and numbers and counts, we forget the person behind the tool. And this is what we should never try to forget. So in our lithic studies, we have found patterning and different strategies in the detachment of these large flakes from cores. For example, this wonderful Kombewa here, a very sophisticated technology that appears very early in time at the site, right from the beginning, and seen at other sites in India and Africa as well. And we also are trying to look at patterning in size preferences or in preferences of other parameters. So you have a distinct concentration, for example, for this particular group of a particular size range. So we are trying to examine that statistically. We are also diacritically examining, deconstructing each and every biface and other tools as well. So to look at the pattern of specific types of flaking for these tools, and flake by flake trying to see how they were made, what is the relationship of one flake to another, plus also trying to break down the reduction sequences of each aspect of the lithic assemblages over here, flake by flake. And in addition to this, we paid a lot of attention and are still doing to the waste products which are generated and the small flake tools as well. So I'll just give you a small example. There is clear evidence of anticipation and planning for raw material absence on site. So if you know you're going somewhere that has no raw material, what are you going to do? You have the tools being brought in. And why didn't they bring in finished hand axes? They could have easily brought the final tool and used at the site. They didn't do that because they planned to use the hand axes or bifaces as cores. So you finish the tool at the site, you get a lot of waste flakes, and these can be retouched and used as tools. Plus, you have curation of hammer stones. Anyone who naps, it's a personal, this is not a very scientific observation, but anyone who naps loves to carry their own hammer stone with them everywhere they go. And so perhaps you have curation of hammer stone, and you have the expedient use of some cobbles which occur in some of the layers. So this is quite sophisticated in the way of approach towards tools. But at the same time, we explored also very interesting issues regarding skills and expertise. In some cases, these errors, these mistakes like the ciré fractures, éclat ciré, or broken flakes, which this is the archaeological examples, and these are from the experimental studies, some broken tips of tools, as also many step fractures, step terminations on the hand axes and on numerous flakes, which in our experimental studies clearly show some aspect of misjudgment, or Akhilesh can explain this better in terms of mistakes in too much force or the wrong angle or something of the sort. But they didn't bother with this. As long as they achieved the final cutting edge of the tool, they didn't really care about too much of this finishing and details, and they didn't mind a few errors. And these errors, if you may call them, continue through time. We get this two conjoining halves of a ciré flake as well, and some more now. So these are very interesting questions we are looking at in terms of expertise and questions of level of skill and craftsmanship of these hominins. Obviously, we need to reconstruct past environments. And so we are doing that on regional scales. We have this huge database now, which we have got some more dates from some other sites as well, which help us in building up stratigraphic sequences on a regional scale. And these are very local stratigraphic sequences in the vicinity of Athirampakam to correlate the site with the immediate landscape around it. And also to go deeper into the trench. So these are all published, you can refer to these. And what it tells you that despite this fluctuation in periods of aridity and or more humidity and vegetational changes, of course, overall it didn't affect much occupation. And we predict a stable habitat with predictable resources throughout the phase of Acheulean occupation at this site. So what was happening overall, if you look at it from perspective in the landscape, there's a great attraction of this locality through time, right from the early to late Pleistocene. It represents a fragmented reduction sequence with different aspects of co-reduction and activities across the landscape. Because at Athirampakkam there was no local raw material, they quarried somewhere elsewhere, brought the large flakes to the site where they finished the tools, and various forms of reduction occurred at the site where they were used and then discarded for actually in quite a fresh condition. So we really don't know why. That's another big question that needs to be thought about. So we have also discussed this in terms of group sizes and the duration of occupation of the site. So at present, these are hypotheses and theories that we need to test perhaps with other sites as well. And this planned discard of the bifaces at the site is something really interesting. Perhaps it was for a non-functional cause as well. We don't know. So, but whatever we do know is that there is a definite geographic and spatial knowledge of these hominins, not only of the raw material sources, but of the resources and the seasonality of these resources. And you have the transmission of information of this particular type of information over a very long period of time with repeated visits across generations of hominins. So this site was something really important, and that these are questions we are looking at. So then what happens? Globally, when you come to the middle, as we all know, there is a gradual obsolescence and abandonment of the typical Acheulean large flake technology in India, at least. There is a shift towards small flake production strategies and increased use of specialized technologies like Levallois, blades, or points. But it's really important that India has its own regional variability, and there's no reason to expect the trajectories of what is happening in Africa or Europe or West Asia or the Near East, wherever it is, to have parallels in India. So we have these technological changes broadly occurring between 400 to 200,000 years ago everywhere, and we see now in India. And in our excavations of these levels which overlie the Acheulean, at this site, what do we actually see? This is also published. You can have a look at the paper. We see three main phases through luminescence dating with PRL, and Dr. Singhvi and his team could give us some very nice dates for the entire sequence. The oldest being around 385, don't forget plus minus 64. And then by around 74,000 years, we have hardly any occupation at the site. There's practically nothing in layer one in this horizon at all. So what is happening technologically? In the first phase, we see the discontinuity of the large flake component. There are very few large flakes, very few bifaces that increasingly become smaller in size. The large flakes almost practically disappear, and you have this proliferation of small flake tools. You have appearance of Levallois. You have some tools with a potential tang. You have you have completely different assemblage, which is now occurring here. And then this continues through time with the dropping off of bifaces and ultimately a switch to a very fine-grained quartzite, as no other raw material was available. And then by this time, by around 74,000, the site was practically abandoned. So these changes are really important. And what our conclusions were that the reduction sequence here, I'm just giving you a very simplified one, is now getting more and more complex. You have points appearing, those sparse. We do have some, you have the laminar element appearing, you have different types of Levallois, discoidal technologies appearing, and proliferation of small flake tools. What does this mean? There are several hypotheses which have suggested modern human dispersals into India, either around 125 with the Middle Paleolithic, or later with microlithic technology. So in our hypothesis, let us forget who made the tools for now. What we do see is the presence of a Middle Paleolithic technology very early in India. We see continuity with the Acheulean, and this is not something new. It has been noted by scholars right from Dr. Sankalia, Mishra, Padaya, and many others through time at other sites. We see a dramatic shift from a preference for large flake tools in the Acheulean to other modes of reduction, which signifies a shift in thinking and approaches towards subsistence patterns. And this has been discussed worldwide as well. We also note that we have no implications on which species made the tools. This is something we cannot even go into right now. But we do see that in India, the situation is very complex. We have local evolutionary trajectories and we have extrinsic influences perhaps at a later time, but we need more dates and more sites to interpret this properly. We cannot speculate as to who made these tools right now, and thus our hypothesis never built in an equation of tools with any particular species, although we can discuss that. And then another important question is the gaps. At Athirampakkam, what is happening at around 74,000 and later in this region, and what is happening between around 1 million to 300,000? This is not there at this site. And so our recent excavations and studies at Sennayanpalayam and many other sites in this region are now giving us very exciting results that my colleagues and I in France and CMA will speak on in another occasion about how to build up this entire regional story, if you may call it that way. And lastly, let us go to the deep south. So where we have these magnificent, I'm going to talk about this region, we have these magnificent dunes, the Theri sand dunes, which a lot of people have studied through time. And in this particular region, at least the upper or late Paleolithic is not as clear as it is elsewhere in India. But we are getting there. And we have some good dates and some forthcoming studies on the technology from these industries, which occur on the surface of and perhaps within these Theri dunes and associated other ferricretes and other surfaces. And this is a new project that we began pilot studies some years back, and now we are able to put together a bigger team to explore what is happening here and what is the relationship between the microlithic artifacts found in this region with what is happening and what is the story in Sri Lanka. So that is as far as our research is concerned. The second question is, what is the fate of all these sites? So we have studied them, that's very fine, and we are publishing, that's great, but what is their fate? So this is a question which we took up along with ISRO in a project some years ago. And what we tried to work with both field studies and satellite data to identify the impacts at different scales at all these sites in the region, in our main region. So at the scale of the site, at various buffer regions, 50 meters to 1 kilometers, and then try to generate some impact indices. Again, this is all published. You can have a look at it and look at what these various practices, whether it's agriculture, various types or water bodies or infrastructure, is affecting prehistoric sites. So, for example, here you see extensive quarrying, which you can see in this map also, and we quantified this so that we can actually generate facts and figures for each and every site and region in this study area, and generated maps not only on modern land use, but also on what measures may be taken for conservation, for salvage, for educational studies, for each and every major site in this area, and also which is what are the land ownership details, so that you can actually speak to the owner of the land and beg and plead not to do anything till you have salvaged whatever you can. And this goes very closely with public outreach. So where the present meets the past. And this is something which at our center we have been doing since 1999. So the aim is very simple. But the methodology is to create an alternate educational models, to connect scientists and children, and to communicate ideas and enhance creativity. And the purpose is very simple. Only by educating children and teachers can you develop sustainable ways to ensure awareness and future conservation. So since 1999, whether it is pre-history in our Little Children's Museum, whether it's the actual scientific methods of excavation, so to teach children that it's not just PWD digging, but there is a process, there is a thought process behind excavations and behind post-excavation analysis, or whether it is teaching children actually how to nap stone tools, of course, taking all due safety protocols, or rock art or metallurgy, whatever it may be. Regarding archaeology, this is something which we are very keen on, we have been doing. Or even conferences organized with other institutes like the IFP here on multidisciplinary perspectives towards the past, or carrying India across these workshops, not only in-house, but across India to Sri Lanka, even to South Korea, collaborating with other institutes for exhibitions, for workshops, and for so many different types of programs, or even teaching, like you see in this image over here, to get a knowledge of this aspect of prehistory out as far as possible, especially to children. And educational films, we made this film in collaboration with the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and publication of children's books. So one more book hopefully will come out soon. And now, ever since this COVID pandemic, we have moved online. You may all be aware of our series Down Ancient Trails and the new one called Herd and Harvest. So to try to connect people globally, breaking barriers of time and space, and to discuss issues of mutual interest in the field of prehistory and hear other people's views. So this is what our research is all about, our work is all about, right from the research component to the public outreach and the conservation issues. I'd like to thank so many institutes that have helped us: the Leakey Foundation, Earthwatch, ISRO, Homi Bhabha Fellowships, Charles Wallace, now coming National Geographic, and of course the ASI for permits, the State Department of Archaeology, Tamil Nadu, and so many officials and people from Tiruvallur district, of course the students, volunteers, and our own staff. So thank you very much for very patiently listening and hopefully not falling asleep. And I'll be happy to take any questions. I'll just stop sharing.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Shanti Kapoor and Dr. Kumar Akhilesh. It was a wonderful talk, and like after listening to this talk, one can really understand what is the kind of problems we face in terms of site management, to kind of understand, interpret, and to kind of present before the public the whole lot of human past that as far as your research indicated goes back to 1.7 or even 1.8 million years back. So thank you really on behalf of Archaeological Sciences Center, IIT Gandhinagar, and I request Professor Michelle Danino to moderate the question answer session. Thank you.
So my own thanks to Dr. Shanti Kapoor and Dr. Akhilesh Kumar. It's such example of a thorough, patient work over many years, which has revealed the complexity of prehistoric context in India. And I think you've provided a model of interdisciplinary investigations, which I hope will be followed by many more archaeologists in India. So now coming to the questions, I can see only 3 or 4 of them. And the first by Anupama is first to congratulate you for a great talk and ask a very basic question. When you say the Acheulean appeared in India not very long after it did in Africa, what is not very long? That is Anupama's question.
That's a very good question, and we have to work with the plus minus of any dating system. So if you have the African Acheulean at 1.7 million, or now even maybe a little older, 1.6, 1.7 million, and India, some of our early dates are almost 1.6, 1.7. But we have been very cautious in this. It's only one site which has given this range of dates. we have been very cautious in taking an estimated mean estimate at 1.5. So it's a very interesting thing to think about. But we need more dates from more sites to be able to make any interpretations as to the origin of the Acheulean. As of now, I don't think there's much doubt that everyone agrees it's in Africa. But still, it leaves us with some scope to think about things.
Thank you. The second question is by Manimekalai, and she asks, are we finding both Acheulean and flake tools in the same layer?
Yes, actually, Acheulean is a terminology for a cultural phase, and the Acheulean in India comprises tools which are largely made on large flakes. So you have hand axes and cleavers, which can be made on very large flakes, and they can be made on cobbles or slabs or whatever it is. But in our side, they are predominantly made on very, very big flakes. And at the same time, you also get tools made on small flakes. So there's no need to associate the Acheulean only with tools like hand axe, cleavers. There is much more to the Acheulean than bifaces. So yes, you do get a lot of tools on flakes of different sizes, in addition to the bifaces.
Thank you, Shanti. And Dr. Ahmed Nasser is asking, thanks for this wonderful lecture. And he has two questions. First, regarding lithics and human skills, if we look deeper, can we recognize the lithics made by one person?
Yes, this is a very good question. This is actually what we are trying to do. So you do get some patterning, and there have been studies of this nature in other parts of the world. So it's not something which people have not attempted. They have attempted. And I think at least you can find perhaps not one hand, but you can find certain preferences of certain modes of flaking. So whether it's made by one or whether that's a tradition in that particular group, this is, I don't know. So, but we're certainly finding patterning in the nature of flaking. It's very clear that you're getting,
amazing.
Yeah, we are finding certain patterns. And we don't know one person, it's a group, or maybe it's a technological aspect. These are questions which we are investigating. But this has been done elsewhere in the world. So it's really worth looking at.
Yes. Dr. Nasser actually has two more questions, I think. Do you think all of Homo erectus group made tools, or are there special people professional in this job?
It's possible, yes, why not? I mean, just speaking from napping workshops, all of us can't make tools. And
Yes.
I would assume certain expertise in manufacture of bifaces for sure. And whereas the small flakes can be retouched by anyone. So certainly, yes. And also, we don't know whether one hand axe is made by one person from beginning to end.
True.
You can have fragmented, you can have different, say somebody producing large flakes and then someone finishing. So these are really valid questions and things we should, but expertise in a group for sure, I think.
And his last question is, what is the difference between Acheulean hand axes and cleavers concerning the function?
That's a very, very big question. So for hand axes, as you know, there have been so many debates on whether, firstly, the very question of whether the hand axe represents a mental template or not. So assume it has some imperative. There is an imperative design in the shape of the hand axe. It is governed by many variables, not only functional for the very long cutting edge, but definitely something more than just functional. So there is aesthetic component built in. There are so many variables which come in when we look at the concept of symmetry, especially in hand axes. So cleavers, there are many studies showing perhaps useful for big game butchery, for cleaving activities like a modern butcher's knife. But for hand axes, the situation becomes much more complex. And there have been use-ware studies, there have been functional studies of the use of hand axes in large game butchery, in use on wood from Pennage, for example. So there have been a number of studies of use-ware on hand axes. So definitely different purposes. But with hand axes, we have that additional element, perhaps, of something special.
Thank you. We have many more questions. Dr. Pravakar, you will stop me if we run out of time, but let me continue meantime. Gauri Aruni is asking how to identify pre-Acheulean sites.
Yeah, it's a matter of dating the sediments.
Yes.
Very good question, because we have had so much controversy about mode 1 core and flake industries in India. So much debate. So I think it's just you have to you have to date the sediments, and not only that, what if they are contemporary with the Acheulean? What if you're finding them contemporary? So you are looking for a completely different reduction sequence. You're looking for something, you're looking for a different way in which the mind was thinking to the process of manufacture of lithics for the old one, at least as compared with the large flake Acheulean. So it's two separate ways of thought. So not only the date, but the reduction sequence and the strategies which were used. It's going to be quite difficult. I mean, in India, there have been so many debates. So we need but the question is open.
Thank you. Vinayak has a question which may be out of the scope of your talk. Is it possible human ancestors arrived in the Indian subcontinent following the sea coast?
Oh, the coastal model, I don't agree with at all. There are many theories which have said modern humans dispersed along the coast, but actually we find the sites in more inland areas where there would be more mosaic resources and of course raw material. And the coastal hypothesis is something which you cannot prove or disprove in any case. No sites have been found which are of any conclusive nature. So I don't agree with that. I think that they went wherever the ability to travel anywhere they wanted was higher than what we can estimate, what we believe often.
Thank you. That's a very important answer. Gopesh Jha is asking very informative talk. I have a small query regarding the appearance of blades. Do you see any Levallois base blade component? Are all blades belonging to lamina? Any comparison with Kunjaram blades? So a very technical.
Yes, no comparison. At least Athirampakam, we have not yet identified any Levallois blades. And Kunjaram is much later time period. So there is no comparison, but we see perhaps a continuity there. In fact, we are going back to Kunjaram for some more work now again, hopefully when the lockdown, when the situation eases out. And that is one of the questions we are looking at, because we get some aspects of blade technology in Athirampakam and others at Kunjaram. So what is the connection? We don't know. So this is one of the studies which we want to look at in detail. It's a very important question.
Thank you. Atsushi Noguchi asks, what type or technology of Upper Paleolithic do you discover from Teri site?
The theories are microliths. So they are made primarily on quartz and chert, some also on chert. And at least for the Indian side of the theories, there are very few blades. It's just microliths largely on flakes. And this is a study we have just started. I'll be able to tell you more in a few months. We have some students who will come and work on that now. So that's really exciting, and a new project which we'll go for field work as soon as possible.
Thank you. Taking up those who have not yet asked their question, in Paleolithic age, Deccan and Peninsular India, this is from Ramendra Singh, Deccan and Peninsular India was a hotspot for human activity, but later, say from Mesolithic times, it shifted towards the northern part of the subcontinent. Please comment.
I think it's all over. Yeah, you're talking about microliths? Well, all over. I can't say that there's any shift as such. It's just everywhere you go, you will find microlithic sites. I don't see any shift.
Right. Ahana Ghosh is asking, is there any evidence of use of animal bones to retouch stone tools or serve as anvils or punches? Are there any bone flakes or bones with anthropic signatures at Athirampakam site or any of the other nearby sites?
Yeah, no bones.
I think the question is from is signed by Sharada. I think they are sitting together.
So no bones. But it's very interesting question, because when we look at flakes, the question is whether they always used a hard stone hammer, or could they have used an antler or something softer. So for that, the experiments come in, which Akhilesh has been doing, to be able to distinguish between certain marks on the flakes if you're using an antler versus if you're using a hard stone hammer. So far at Athirampakkam, at least throughout the Acheulean, we find the only evidence of hard stone hammers. That's why we spoke of the possibility of curating hammer stones. At present, we didn't find anything which can replicate experimental retouch with an antler or something softer. We didn't get those signatures, but of course, this is a very important issue, and more studies needs to be done, at least use on Indian material. With flints, it's a different story. But if you're working on quartzites or very coarse-grained quartzites, that too, what are the patterns we see? For this only experiments will tell us. It's a very interesting question.
I think we'll take just a couple more questions. Tarun is asking, what is the reason behind occupying the same site after a gap of from 1 million years ago to 3.72 million years ago? I think it is. Yes. It should be 3,007.
Yeah, it's a very, very good question. Actually, this is something which has come out only after that there is a disconformity, and then you can see that very clearly in the layers and also now in the dates and in the lithics. So we don't know. I don't know. Maybe it's the sediment is missing because of some major environmental change. Maybe for some reason people shifted, that particular locale was not good because and people shifted somewhere else. We see a change in the fluvial dynamics from more lacustrine or very low energy fluvial sediments to small braided channels and braided streams coming up later. So this particular gap is the reason why we are exploring elsewhere. No site will tell you the whole story. So the reason for these gaps in the record, are they real? Are they local? Are they regional? I don't know. I have no idea. So this is what the research is now all about. So this site is well and good, but it cannot tell you the whole story as anywhere else. So that's why the regional scale studies are what will fill in perhaps some pieces, or maybe not.
Thank you. Saurav Lai asks, some tools were retouched, like hand axes and flakes. It's showing their knowledge about how to develop or modify the tools. Please inform us about the retouching techniques.
For hand axes or for okay,
I think it's about hand axes.
So hand axes are flaked bifacially in a particular pattern. So there are many questions, but definitely for us, the tool maker had some shape in his mind. There are many theories about the concept of the morphology of the hand axe itself. I won't go into that, but what it does require is some type of structured flaking. Bifacial, maybe on all sides, maybe on only one side, maybe partial, it varies. And this flaking has to be done very clearly, intentionally. If you do something wrong, you see that mark on the tool. If you make a mistake, we see that evidence if they're not able to correct it. And if all is fine, you get a beautiful, in the later phases at least you get beautiful, refined, symmetrical tools which are thin with lovely edges. But that is the ideal. At Athirampakkam, you don't have that perfect hand axe always. You have all sorts of shapes and morphologies which are a result of not only the flaking, the skill, the flake type selected, the morphology of the raw material of the original flake selected, it varies. Plus, when you are looking at other retouch on other tools, we have talked about hand axes, but there are so many other tools, the large flake tools. So that retouch is again different. It's mostly focused on the edges. It may be very irregular. It may not be very systematic or well done at all. So there is so much to look at.
Yes, thank you. And I think the last question is again from Gopesh Jha. He wants to know, due to the use of bifaces as flake cores at EMP, that should be early middle Paleolithic, Bering Horizon, do you see any trend in scar patterns of cores and dorsal faces of flakes?
Okay,
So again, it's
so
very
what
difficult.
our suggestion of the bifaces as a source of flakes is only for the Acheulean, because in the Acheulean levels there is no raw material. There's no large boulder from which you can make a large flake. Nothing. So it had to be brought to the site. So when you are bringing something to the site, you know you are coming for a specific time period, duration. You know you are maybe competing with large carnivores there, also hungry for something else. You are coming for aquatic resources, maybe for large game, whatever may be the reason. So when you are bringing a hand axe which is fully finished, maybe the edges will get dull in transport. And what we do find in the excavation is hundreds of these small flakes that come in the last stages of biface thinning. So this is very clear from experiments in India, our own studies and elsewhere. So why? These small flakes, the bifaces were finished at the site. The final shape and thinning was done at the site. You get a lot of waste products. Some of the suitable waste products which have a good cutting edge were picked up and retouched and used. Many may have been used without retouch as well. And this is a study for microware, which Akhilesh is going to do. So it's not necessary that only the retouched flakes were used. So in this case, when you're talking about dorsal flake scar patterning, it's the number of the hand axes are not flaked very intensively in these early levels as compared to something happening later in time. That trend we are looking at also. It's not necessarily true, because even from the very early Acheulean in Africa and here, you can get some very beautiful symmetrical hand axes which stand out in opposition to the other so-called ugly ones. So it's not true that always the best are later. Not true. It depends on so many factors as well. So this is what we are also looking at. And you are right, you have to factor in dorsal flake scars, ventral shaping scars, and more important, the manner of flaking. How they are organizing the flaking on the tool. That's also important.
Thank you,
Okay.
Dr. Shanti Bapu. We have run out of questions, and I think it is an endless exploration. We can understand the complexity of this field. It's mind-boggling. There's a lot of appreciation of your talk in the chat box, and you can see that, and we will send it to you. There's also a request for the video to be shared online, and yes, all the videos of this webinar series are shared online, and the three preceding videos are already available online in the website of the Archaeological Sciences Center, IIT Gandhinagar. So those who wish to view your video can do so later, very much. And we're glad that we are able to preserve such valuable contributions, and which shows the depth of this field. So thank you very much from my end. And Dr. Prabhakar, if you would like to conclude this session.
Yeah, before thanking Professor Shanti Bapu and Dr. Akhilesh Kumar, what I really kind of appreciate is the kind of public outreach. I mean, what Sharma Center is doing, that is really an appreciable contribution from them. And that's how we are going to preserve our heritage. The younger minds, the younger students, they learn about much and more about archaeology and the kind of methodologies involved. So it will reach far and wide, I believe. And I was discussing with Professor Bapu earlier also, I think Atrambakkam deserves a World Heritage status. I think we all should collectively work for that. Maybe we can start working on what are the attributes like from Atrambakkam, so that there are certain cultural criteria that has to be presented before the World Heritage Committee. Maybe I would request Professor Shanti Bapu to initiate a dialogue with the government of Tamil Nadu. I think that will be the right forum. They can submit a dossier with your help, of course. I mean, without you, it cannot be possible. So I once again thank you, Professor Shanti Bapu and Dr. Kumar Akhilesh, for this wonderful talk. And I also thank all the participants who have taken their time to attend this lecture. And hope to see you again in the next lecture in January. And thank you.
Thank you very much for inviting us and having us here. And thanks to all who listened.
Most welcome.
Okay.
Thank you very much.